Can I call you Britt?
Yeah, please.
Thank you so much. It is an absolute treat to have you on this show. If anybody has not gotten it yet, I'm going to start off by saying buy this book immediately. It's fantastic. I'm excited that you had the chance to distill all of your wisdom into that. And I look forward to going through how you got to a place where this book was something that you could produce, chose to produce, because, writing a LinkedIn article is hard enough. I can't imagine what it takes to actually put hundreds of pages into print that are as thoughtful and worth reading as this. So, for the folks who don't know you, I came across your content on TikTok originally. I think my wife shared it with me. She's going to love listening to this episode. And let's talk a little bit about sort of why you even started going on social media in general and kind of what your aim is for reaching a mass audience.
Okay, yeah, so my name's Britt Hartley, and I go by the tagline No Nonsense Spirituality. And I would say why I'm on social media or why I'm doing what I'm doing is really kind of part of my story and embedded in my story. So, grew up in religion, deconstructed from religion, and had all kind of the normal. If you ever have heard someone go through a deconstruction process, pretty across the board, normal things that happen with that, very disorienting. And then found myself in a kind of atheism that turned into nihilism, where I lost all social and psychological anchors. And as we were talking before we were on air here, really started to face into the void and had it's this feeling of being naked to the universe where you have no way to deal with things like your fear of isolation, your fear of meaninglessness, your fear of death, your fear of freedom. These are the four existential fears that all humans have that brains work very hard to try to hide from thinking about, and really struggled with deep nihilism and feeling like life was not worth living. And like you, found a different way of being that I didn't sense before as just a pure atheist, where there was a different and this is through mushroom experiences, and I also have a mystic teacher in a wisdom tradition. Um, and I've explored religion and spirituality my whole life. I have a master's degree in theology with an emphasis on the future of American religion. So I sensed that there was something here, and kept trying to dig into it, and had to kind of move all the dogma out of the way that I just couldn't get on board with anymore, and found that there was kind of a different way to be that I didn't realize when I was so deep into nihilism, and that there were spiritual tools here that were worth rescuing from religion, or from kind of the house of religion and spirituality. And at the beginning, I really truly believed that no one would listen to me because in spirituality, there's three really large camps. There's three really loud camps. One is religion, and this is the correct religion, or you're going to hell, whatever hell is. And then there's the atheist kind of camp that just says all of this is stupid, all of religion is toxic, all of religion is evil. And then there's kind of the woo camp that says, like, yeah, religion is stupid, but like hold your crystals and, make wishes to the universe and manifest your $1 million and whatever. Those are kind of the three loudest camps on offer. And so I really didn't have any belief that anybody would hear me. But like you, I just started talking anyway because it felt so meaningful to me. And it felt like if I'm going to live the life that I want to live, which is the benefit of going through nihilism, you have to be really honest about what your authentic life worth living is going to be. Then this is what I wanted to talk about. I wanted to talk about spirituality and meaning of life and spiritual tools without any dogma, without any faith, without too much woo where we're really going out into the weeds and doing a lot of pseudoscience, because it really saved my life. And I'm seeing a lot more people struggle with nihilism than I would have thought when it was just me going through it. So I started talking about it and was really surprised that there were so many other people who were searching for something, who were skeptical, who were overwhelmed with kind of the options in the spiritual world, but wanted more to life
Mm.
and wanted to understand what mystics were talking about when they were talking about this different way of being. And so it really just started for me, just because I wanted to talk about it, just for my own purpose and meaning of life, not really thinking that anybody would listen, and was surprised to find a lot of people were like me, who were a little bit burned out by religion or skeptical of religion, but wanting something more, and wanting some way to navigate that. So why I do what I do is kind of really a part of my story, and how I create my own meaning and purpose in life.
First of all, amazing summary. Thank you for that. Um, for people who don't know and for whatever reason are too lazy to Google it, what does nihilism mean? How would you define it?
Yeah, so nihilism, just as an ism, is just the philosophical belief that there's no inherent meaning in the universe, that you're not here for a specific reason, the universe doesn't particularly care about you. It's really that whatever life is, whatever's going on here, there seems to be no inherent meaning. Um, Now, that doesn't mean you can't create meaning. That doesn't mean that we can't have maybe subjective meaning or things like that. But it just means that when it comes to things like a god or a purpose, that the universe doesn't seem to have that on offer. Now, for some people, that's really positive. Oh, I can create my own meaning. Fantastic. And they're off to the races, and I've seen people move into optimistic nihilism really easily, especially people who genuinely enjoy being alive, like genuinely enjoy life. I'm a little bit more on the neurotic end of the mental health spectrum. I've struggled with depression. I've had a philosophical mind that goes to some darker, deeper places. And so nihilism for me, on the side of experience, it wasn't positive. It was very scary. It was terrifying. If we're just going to be candid here, I think the hardest thought that I had was this idea that if I have no free will, and there's no purpose to any of this, and the universe doesn't care, and all of this is suffering, and I have to kill conscious life in order to eat, and it's just this system of violence that I didn't consent into, then the most moral thing for me to do would be to withdraw my consent for life.
Mm.
And I was in that place for about 2 years. So, I mean,
Wow, that's a long time.
a long time. And it was really the fact that I had children that kept me alive during that time. If not for them, we may not be having this conversation. And so for me, it was really this black hole void place where there's no up or down or left or right. There's no reason to make one decision over another. And I had been so burned by religion that I was skeptical to all the spiritual space, all the woo, because all of that just felt like make believe distractions to reality.
Mm.
And I was missing something in my overall skepticism to all spirituality. And a lot of that just comes from religious trauma from my upbringing. So, but once I was able to kind of pierce through that and really find secular spirituality, the science of spirituality, have some experiences with psychedelics, have some experience with mystics, have some experiences with meditation, something else started to open up that was different than just religion. It was different than dogma. It was a different way of being. It was a different way of experiencing life. And that shift really helped me to go from wanting to die to today being really excited to be alive, to be excited to just be having this conversation. And so nihilism is just the belief that there's no inherent meaning in the universe, and how you, for some people it's positive, for some people like me it's very negative, and you have to kind of find your way through that space. And mysticism and a lot of the things that you talk about on your podcast are tools that can help.
The interesting part about how my nihilism showed up was that it came after I'd had sort of a spiritual awakening and several what I'd call significant mystical experiences, where before I had been atheist slash agnostic, mostly atheist. Then I have all these profound experiences where I feel one with the universe, and that like I am God, and that like I am a vision from God, that like I'm a dream of God and I'm eternal. And you have the opportunity, if anybody's had psychedelics, I'm sure you can relate. You can feel infinity suddenly, something outside what your mind can comprehend. And it all felt really beautiful at the time. And then, I don't know, it was probably a couple of years in, I get my legs swept out from underneath me with this enormous, crushing fear of death. And with that came the nihilism. And I think if I'm peeling it apart psychologically, I think, well, I know I was on a mission to destroy my ego. That was like my stated mission. I'm going to kill my ego. And it's so funny. The ego wants to be here. So when you make this decision to try and destroy it, it will eventually fight back in ways you can't see or understand, and it will not be pretty. You cannot reach enlightenment or peace or nirvana or heaven or whatever you want to call it through force and destruction. It will not work. So if you're on that path, find a softer, gentler, love-filled way, or I promise you, you will find yourself in a situation that is a struggle, if not terrifying. And a lot of my deepest thoughts came in the shower, of all places. And I remember when I was first struggling with nihilism, this notion that if everything is infinite, then I've lived this life infinite times. Like we can't logically understand the concept of infinity, that like everything can happen, has happened, will happen. And so what's the point? And there was a time where I finally just said, okay, let's assume that's true, because we don't know, but let's assume that's true. You're in the game of life. You have a body, you have consciousness, and you're here. There's really only two reasonable choices: exit the game or play to win. That's it. What else? What other possible choice could there be? And I thought long and hard about, is it worth exiting the game? And I got a lot of joy out of life and the complexity and the puzzle of it. Even if you just look at it as a video game, a really advanced video game, it's fun to play. Even when it sucks, it's still fun to play. Complex problem solving. It's like, okay, so then what does playing to win look like? And that is a really interesting exercise if you haven't sat down to really consider what that means, right? Once you're past the money and the power and fame and all the kind of stuff that you grew up because thanks to Western marketing convinced you that these are the ideals to hold in mind, what does it really look like? And it's like, oh, wow, okay, so pointed towards the divine. Well, if I don't believe in God per se in the religious sense, like what does that even mean? And I do think that there's this bizarre underlying code to how the universe works, where the good, the true, and the beautiful represent divinity. And if you let go enough, if you surrender enough, and that's a tough word to really understand the concept of, the answers come to you. The most divine next things to do comes to you as intuition continuously. So as long as you point yourself in the direction that I'm going to do the greatest good that serves the universe in whatever way that shows up, and it changes from moment to moment what that might mean, then I'm living a good life. I'll be filled with love. And it seems like abundance just shows up when you do that. And it doesn't mean it's easy, because it's been a harrowing couple of years coming back from staring into that black abyss. And it still hits me every once in a while where I'm just like, oh, I'm gonna die. And not like, oh, like died, but like it all just the fades to black. What do you do with that? And it's like this continuous it's almost like you have to invite it in as a friend at dinner, this fear, and sit with it. Because when you do, the story of where it comes from comes out, and that is the answer to how you, at least for me, how you can start to get around it. Is like, why does this matter so much? Why do you need to be so significant?
Mm.
Why do you need to be so important in the scope of the universe? Why do you need to be that which everything revolves around? Why isn't it enough that you had this miraculous journey? I can hear the birds singing outside, flowers blossoming everywhere. I've got beautiful children, right? Like, why isn't that enough? And it's under those answers to those questions that you can find the hurt that needs the healing. And that
Mm.
becomes part of the game.
There was a lot there. You packed a lot into that couple of minutes there. And I was taking some notes because I want to pull on some of these threads that you laid out. But it reminds me of Albert Camus, he's a philosopher who talked a lot about nihilism and absurdism in his case. And his approach to philosophy was very much like the question that you asked yourself. His approach to philosophy was that the first question of philosophy is, do you commit suicide? Because it's really like, do you consent to this? Like, do
Mm.
you consent to life as it is? And he encouraged people to not go that route, to be clear. And then he focused on this shift that for him, was more absurdism, but it can be called existentialism and other things. But it's the shift that you talk about, where if you realize that life is a game and you realize that there's some absurdity to wanting to be special in the universe, and the universe saying, I don't really care. And there's some absurdism to wanting there to be meaning and purpose, and the universe saying, I don't really care. And once he kind of embraced that paradox and that absurdity, he was essentially able to recreate his video game to the game that he wanted to play, just at the level of experience. And that is the shift that I see from philosophers, from just normal people who have survived nihilism, from writers, people like Tolstoy who have gone through nihilism. Uh, Anyone who's actually faced this and talked about it and lived to tell the tale will talk about this kind of video game concept in some ways.
Mm.
Sometimes they'll say matrix, sometimes they'll say but it's this concept of, can I shift my life rather than being meaningful in the grand universal scheme of things, to focus on the experience of what it is to just be conscious and awake, and settle into that? And what is that like? And it's actually a lot different from just sitting in logic land where you're thinking, do my actions have meaning in 10,000 years? And the answer to that is no. Like, if you're just in that pure kind of logic space of, does my life matter on a million-year scale, the answer is probably no. But at the level of experience, because we are conscious, whatever that means, because the lights are on, there's something else to life that you're missing when you're just looking at life at that level. And you've talked about it a lot. You talked about the birds are singing. And this is something that happened to Eckhart Tolle when he had kind of his transcendent mystical experience, is when he woke up the next day, after just kind of having a really powerful mystic experience just kind of thrust upon him. He noticed the birds singing, and like, my God, like, birds are singing and there's sound waves and I can hear it, and we're flying through the universe, and look at this flower and look at these colors. And it was like being a child again and having curiosity and wonderment. And I have this body, and sometimes it resonates with someone when I'm talking to them because we're hitting on something that we feel is true.
Mm.
And then sometimes my body does all these other kinds of crazy things, and there's a whole history in my body there's a whole universe in my body that I can spend my lifetime trying to understand and still not understand it. And then there's this whole universe outside of me. And then there's these other people, and they have their own different kind of ways of seeing reality. And we're trying to figure out what's going on, and everything is magical again. And that's the shift that I try to do in my work. I'm really fighting on two fronts. I'm trying to tell the religious, hey, you're kind of missing the point.
Right.
Like, the mystical experience that started your religion, you're no longer doing that thing. You're just making clubhouses and doing identity markers and playing games of dogma, and it's all ego driven and all of that. But I'm also trying to tell the atheists, hey, there's still magic
Yes.
in reality. There's a magic of reality, and reality, whatever it is, consciousness, whatever it is, the way that we're connected in ways that we don't fully understand yet is more mysterious than we could have even ever imagined. And so it's trying to find the space in between them where it's like telling the religious to calm down a little bit, but telling the atheists who are getting a little bit cynical, not just skeptical, but cynical, that, hey, there's another way of being where it feels like you're a child again, because children don't wake up and say, what am I going to do that's going to be meaningful in 10,000 years? They just wake up and they're in their body and they play. And how can I do that as an adult? And so that is what saved my life. It's waking up one day and saying, if this is a video game, if there's a way to play this in the way that you talked about, what game do I want to play? Ooh, you know what my body really loves, and this brain, whatever this meat sack is, really loves? I really love conversation. So how can I structure my life so I have more of that, so that I can wake up and, like today, have a conversation about what I think is the most interesting thing to talk about, which is like, what is going on with reality and what does it mean to be human? And shifting my life so that I have more and more of what I want to be experiencing and less of things that just suck my life energy, like rat race kind of things and what do I look like and all of that kind of stuff. Really did change the nature of my game so that it's one that I wanted to play, even though I know that it ends.
Do you ever
And yeah, go
listen
ahead.
to Jordan Peterson at all?
Yeah, sometimes.
He was super helpful for me in bridging the religion gap. He did this, I think it's like a 13-part series. It might be even more than that, where when he was a professor, he did multi-hour lectures on the.
Yeah, I've listened to all of those. I've sent them to some people, some philosophical people. He was really, I don't agree with all of his things. He's in a place where as a public figure, he's asked to comment really on everything, and so it's not going to be, I'm not going to agree with everything that he says, but his long form lectures on Dostoevsky, Nietzsche, some of the existential philosophers, his thoughts on nihilism from a psychological standpoint, which is his actual focus and actual training. I did find some of that to be helpful, really, because he was condensing deeply philosophical work, which is really hard to read at a firsthand level, just because philosophers write really obscure, almost on purpose sometimes, and it can be hard to sift through. The difference between someone like Jordan Peterson and myself is Jordan Peterson's a little bit more hesitant to let go of literal belief of God. And he's sometimes, gets into debates where it's really hard to pin him down. And, you'll ask something like, if all humans were to die, would there be no God? And he says he literally can't answer that. Like, or you ask him if Jesus really did really was resurrected, and he said, well, it'd take me 4 hours to answer that. And so some of that, I'm a little bit more willing to say, maybe this is all happening in our mind. That's okay with me. Like, I have my skepticism. I tend to be very science driven, but there's still a way to do spirituality and mysticism and not turn off our rationality. We can keep neuroscience at the table. We can make this a 21st century conversation. We don't have to go back to Iron Age gods to get there. And so that would probably be a difference between me and Jordan Peterson. But his lectures on existentialism and nihilism and all of those things really were helpful for people, including myself.
What it did for me is it gave me permission to visit religion at all,
Mm,
especially religious texts, because the way he deconstructed them was through mythology and symbolism.
yeah. And
And
really a lot of like Jungian archetypes, because he has a
exactly.
lot of Jungian training, and that is a different way. Uh, I have a little bit more experience with that just from being in the religious training for a while, that there's a mystic way to read text where it's not about the literal, it's about what does this mean psychologically, and doing that actually can be incredibly beneficial. So I still read, even though I would still probably call myself an atheist at this point. I mean, I have a degree in theology. Like, I still love to read holy texts, and I am an ordained Sufi, which is the mystic branch of Islam. And I will sometimes study those texts with a teacher, but in a totally different way, in a mystic way rather than in a literal way. And there's a lot of wisdom there that I fear we're losing as we kind of throw all of religion away.
Maybe out with the bathwater.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that it's interesting when I will do some of the psychedelic journeying or deep meditation, things will just sort of come to me. And one of the things that came to me at some point was the notion that being in flow state is heaven.
Mm.
When we surrender to the flow of the universe and we are just, whether it's dancing, making love, creating art, that embodiment of calling forth the good, the true, and the beautiful as part of what the universe is asking for. It's like it's constantly calling for this next evolution, and that we are instruments to that evolution. And when we're in that flow state, everything, you're not stressed about anything, you're not anxious, you're not depressed, you're just in it, and everything is, generally speaking, perfect. And you look at the concept of the fall in the garden. And I interpret that as, before we came into this notion that we are in control, that we are these demigods who can wrangle the universe into the vision that we quote unquote want, aka that our ego wants, right? To avoid pain and to seek pleasure. Everything that's happening outside my window is just happening. It's like billiard balls knocking together. If this, then that. Exactly as the universe and whatever bizarre substrate underneath calls forth. There's no decisioning happening. It's already preordained. And when you're in flow state, you're not deciding anything. It's just happening. I look at it as that's what surrender means. You have completely, entirely woven yourself into the fabric of the universe, and you are in the dance. And the more we separate ourselves from that, and the more we try and grab the steering wheel of the universe and put it into the position that we want, and separate ourselves as separate and other from the universe, the closer we get to hell. So that is an interesting concept, I think, to debate, because I don't think it's a settleable issue. What do you think about that idea?
Yeah, that's interesting. I've heard, many people take different lessons from the Adam and Eve story, and it's one of the reasons why these stories survive and they're so compelling is because they can mean different things for different people, and there's some deep kind of symbolism going on as we try to understand it and as we wrestle with these texts. There's a reason that these, even if there's no God, even if there's no inspiration that creates scripture, we at least have to say for some reason this story has lasted thousands of years.
Right.
And that by itself is interesting enough to take a look at it. And I've worked with a lot of these stories, and there's especially from the Jungian analysis, there can be very interesting things to dive into. Uh, for me, I think where I see people struggle with what you just said is that first you kind of have to have a death of free will, and that can be very disorienting for people, and that can be
Sure
really
can.
hard to shift with, because implied in what you said is that we, at the very least, don't have as much free will as we think we do. And so you essentially have to then consent. Can you get on a roller coaster ride in your body, knowing that you didn't create the ride? Like, however my body reacts, and my core values that I didn't choose, and my gender that I didn't choose, my experiences that I didn't choose, my parents that I didn't choose, and my genetics that I didn't choose, and all of the things that created the universe to express me in whatever way that I'm expressing, we almost have to kind of have this ego death with it, that we're not as in control of this body as we think we are. And I see people, at least for a time, really struggle with that. What does that mean for my choices? What does that mean for accountability? What does that mean for the justice system? Does that mean that, and there's even some evidence that especially atheists are really watching, where we can take people, it takes a couple hours, we can take people through why they don't have free will at various, we can show them the studies, we can show them split brain studies, we can show them some neuroscience, we can get at it philosophically. But over a few hours, you can take a group of people and convince them that they don't have free will to some degree. And what we find is there are some studies that are showing that morality actually goes down, that they'll go to the grocery store and
Steals.
steal some stuff at the self-checkout because whatever happens, the universe was always going to make it this way. And so there are conversations right now about how much people can handle and how much we can support this conversation about not having free will. Otherwise, there may, just like if we put out how to make a bomb online, we don't do that because it's not safe for us. We don't have enough safeguards in place for that to be information at a mass level. And we're starting to have conversations around free will in similar ways, which is how can we have the supports to have this conversation so that it's not too psychologically debilitating, because people who do like a headless guided meditation with Joseph Lang, or some of these experiences where you really see that you don't have free will. It's just kind of the universe, you know, and the billiard balls and all that kind of thing. We can see some people really struggle with that psychologically in ways that makes us kind of more hesitant to, at least when we're having these conversations, what are the safeguards that we need to have in place? What are ways to shift with this so that we can get to that place where you're enjoying life, enjoying the ride, while also knowing that you didn't choose this particular roller coaster that you're on. You didn't choose this particular ride that you're a part of. So that's kind of what comes up for me, which is I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying, but I'm much more hesitant lately on how I approach that, because it's such a difficult psychological shift that takes time, and there's questions that always come up that you kind of need to be ready with people to be able to go into. And so I think, you know, when you listen to Robert Sapolsky talk about free will and how do we do this, you know, he really says, based on his lifetime studying this, that we need to do this incrementally, because I don't think we can do it all as a species at once. So we just do it incrementally over time, recognize when we have more or less kind of freedom of choice. And so that's actually already happening in the justice system, because it can be, like, I just want to acknowledge that it can be psychologically disorienting.
I would say severely so.
Mm.
All of this stuff, when you really get to the edge, because I feel like we as Westerners live in this tight little circle of conceptual awareness that has been very designed by society, where we've shed community and we've shed mysticism and we've shed all these things. And so you live in this little bubble. And once you pop that bubble and step outside, the places you go can be so beautiful and awe-inspiring, and literally bring you to your physical knees with tears of joy and heart exploding open. And to the exact same degree, bring you to the same knees, same tears. What is happening? How could this be possibly true? How is no one talking about this? This is so terrifying. And you get these panic responses because we've lived so long so unsheltered. What I think is really interesting and fascinating is that the rise of things like TikTok, where so much information is available to people now that would have been impossible in the 90s, right? Not that long ago, is happening at the exact same time we see a rise in psychedelics, a resurgence. Because if people couldn't find content like this, and they in en masse are having these experiences where they're meeting infinity and coming to grips with the idea that maybe I don't have as much free will as I thought, maybe as little as none, right? And all these things coming up, if there wasn't resources to have access to, I think that would be catastrophic for society. So I
Mm.
find it interesting the way to me, it's not an accident that these things rise at the same time. It's almost like the premise of yin yang, the idea that everything will always be in balance. As much pain and suffering as there currently is in the world, because by God, there's a lot, there's as much beauty and love and open heartedness and growth and return to femininity and all these other things that are sort of countervailing that. And it's almost
Mm.
like it's to the exact same degree.
Yeah, I don't know if I could go that far where it's the same degree, because that places some truth claims onto the universe that I don't know if I can quite do. But where I meet that thought, where I meet you in the same place in a different way. And the way that I meet that is this Jungian concept of the collective unconscious. And that if we, for example, with religion, it's been very masculine, been very hierarchical, been very patriarchal. And so then there's this growing desire for the feminine, for the mother, for the intuition, for the softness, for the nurturing. And uh maybe how that happens is not so much to do with the universe, and maybe that is kind of the collective subconscious that we have. And we can see this throughout history, where when we get too far one direction, for whatever reason, we all start kind of moving in another direction. Now, that's mysterious. I don't know how that happens. It could be some universal concept. It could be just because our brains are so similar and can pass on things and conversation and society and all of that. I, like most things with mysticism, I'm agnostic to whether it's something universe or something just in my brain. I'm to it being either. But that's kind of more of where I meet that concept of the yin yang concept, that there's something going on where we can sense there's an imbalance, even collectively, and we can start moving as like pendulums back and forth. And I was a history teacher before I did this work, and so we can certainly see that throughout history. For me, what comes up with what you're saying is we may be the first generation of people for tens of thousands of years at least that are facing these questions, like you said, without a community,
Mm.
without a story. And so when people say like nihilism is hard, or like I'm suicidal and it's hard in a way that no other generation had that hard, because every other generation had community and stories and
Wise women
something,
and shamans.
wise women and shaman, and ways to make sense of death in community, that it was a part of life, that they mattered, that there was wisdom. There was a lot of things going on. And so when we lost all of that, as we as religion went kind of insane and started to really be about power and money, and so people just started abandoning spirituality and story, and the communities that are formed from those stories all together. It's like not only are we facing some of the harshest truths we've ever had to face as humanity, things like free will, things like recognizing how small we are in the universe, things like that. But we're also doing it with less resources, especially communal resources, than we've ever had in the past. And so what I'm seeing is this gap between, there's all these young people. I'm meeting 16-year-olds that are seriously philosophically nihilistic and or
Wow.
suicidal, really facing these deep questions because
Interesting.
society is crumbling all around them. I mean, there's
Right.
no all institutions, all stability, not just religion, everything, gender, self,
Right.
sexuality, everything is just deconstructing, right? And and then it costs so much to be alive, and there's so much human suffering, that I'm seeing very young people with deep philosophical nihilistic questions. But the gap between a 16-year-old and the philosophy and the mysticism and the tools that can help, there's such a big gap between those,
Mm.
that I think it's one of the reasons that we're seeing Gen Z really pay the price for the deconstruction of religion.
Mm.
Because because they're missing that nest period that every other generation got of community and identity and belonging and shaman and rites of passage.
Right.
And so
15,
now,
16, everyone would get that sort of, okay,
yeah,
time to sit
you're a
down
part
and
of the
have
tribe now. Like,
a
you
real
matter to
talk.
the tribe now. Yeah. And so now not only are they facing like these really hard questions, but they're doing it with so few resources. And of course, like, we look at depression and anxiety in Gen Z, and it's just through the roof. And I think, there's various aspects to that, but I think this aspect is a part of it. And so when we look at someone like Lisa Miller, who's one of the lead scientists on the science of spirituality. She's a professor at Columbia, and she's given us some of the strongest science and studies around spirituality. And her conclusion was that if spirituality were a pill that you could give teenagers, it would be our best pill against depression, against risky behaviors, and against suicide.
Mm.
And so there's something here in what we're talking about, but there's a gap between where that knowledge is and access to that knowledge and access to some of that philosophy, and the young people who are having to really face this on their own. And that's the gap that worries me a lot, and the gap that I try to speak up in, because I think they're paying the price.
I think you're right. My kids are still fairly young, 7 and 10. So it's been lightly uh, lightly engaged in terms of spirituality. They always have questions. I love the questions from children. It's so beautiful. It's such a interesting exercise of healing and reparenting yourself, being able to have kids. It's such a gift. One of the things I want to turn back to, and that I loved in the book, is the notion of the hyper masculization of society. And I'm curious, did you ever see the HBO special Exterminate All the Brutes?
I don't think so, no.
Highly, highly recommend. I
Mm,
probably brought it up a half dozen times on this podcast at this point because it constantly
mm,
seems relevant. So the notion is that if you go back to, I don't know if it was Constantine or who it was a long time ago, it was like the shift from the feminine, divine creation, right? All of the idea of divinity had at least 50-50 masculine feminine related to it, and was largely driven by first person mystical experience. And that when that shifted into this patriarchal hierarchy, at that moment, it was almost like there was a march across the world to recruit. But unfortunately, what recruiting looked like wasn't, hey, we've got this thing to sell you. And if you don't buy into Christianity, that's okay. We'll go on to the next town. It was, we'll kill you and your entire family and take everything you have. And that was done around the world for hundreds of years. And in doing that, not only did we end up with this patriarchal, almost monarchy, we also lost all of the connection to how to have these conversations. What are we doing here? How do you talk to the trees? It sounds crazy. Like that idea, if you had even given me the notion in my 20s, I would have laughed myself out of the room. What do you mean talk to the trees? We can talk to everything. We are a part of the universe. In the same way an atom is a part of a cell, is a part of a molecule, is a part of my hand, is a part of me. I'm a part of the earth. The earth's part of the solar system. It's, of course, we're all one unit at some level. Keep going up the hierarchy until you've reached something that's inclusive enough. And whether it was in South America or Asia or North America, right, with the Native Americans, everywhere people didn't even have this notion of I. Like the pronoun I in many cultures didn't even exist. It was this notion that we are, of course, we're all part, like me and the buffalo have a relationship because we're all part of the same unit. So of course I'm going to honor that in the same way that we honor each other and blah, blah, blah. Anyway, if you fast forward to, let's call it the 20th century, how do we end up with what looks like toxic masculinity? I don't actually think it's toxic masculinity. I think it's an absolute abject poverty and dearth of femininity. It was completely extracted from society, because if you were in a position of power, you couldn't be a female. And so all of the ways in which that would trickle down naturally, having that feminine energy, was gone. And if you were a man, speaking as one who grew up in the 90s and 80s, like, to have any feminine traits was like the worst thing you could possibly do. You would be
Yeah.
ostracized instantaneously, regularly, and with reckless abandon. And so, what does that end up doing? Well, we create a society that's unbelievably productive, right? We create a lot of things. We have an unbelievable amount of order, right? And this notion that order is masculine and chaos is feminine. I think people shy away from the word chaos as a feminine concept, but chaos to me just means new, life,
And breaking
generative,
open. Yeah, it's
right?
breaking open.
And if you don't have those two things in balance, you end up with absolute domination and stasis. So I think the reason, this is a long way of coming around the deconstruction concept. I think the reason why everything's getting deconstructed is because we end up with such a hyper masculinized society for so long, with so much structure, so much rigidity, and people just starving for the feminine side of life's experience, that we started tearing everything apart and creating almost an anarchy, because it's seen that, okay, well, we don't want this, so we'll have that. And I think what we'll eventually settle into, hopefully for all of us, is a beautiful divine balance of both. Because you don't want absolute utter chaos. You don't. People who
Mm.
haven't seen it or read enough history don't know what that's really like. It's a lot of death. It is unsafe to exist. But you also don't want this. You don't want this oppressive society where half of people have no opportunity and the other half are miserable. Because the men over here, even though they're in charge, they're not happy. They're also killing themselves and cheating on their wives and doing drugs and burying themselves in alcohol, right? It's not a win for them either. That's the ironic part.
Yes.
Is it looks
Yes.
like from the outside, I imagine, and from the people that I've heard speak as a woman, it's like, oh, well, they get all the benefits. It's like, it looks like they do, but they're actually in living hell. So
Mm.
everybody loses in that dynamic.
Mm. I have so much to say on this subject. This is one of my soapbox things that I get into. Um, so I'm going to start, yeah, kind of where you started, where we used to live in matriarchies, and we have some evidence of this, not as much as not a ton, because a lot of these are pre-writing societies, but it seems to be that the gods before agriculture, so before 10,000 years ago, uh, women were not just like the divine women we see in religion today that are like sometimes a saint, or someone like Mary who's kind of only important because of her virginity and that she bore a man. But these were actual powerful women who had wisdom and music and art, and especially language, which is really interesting. We see a lot of the early goddesses being the goddess of language, which a little bit makes sense, just in the sense that even today, a 4-year-old girl usually is more language developed than a 4-year-old boy.
Mm.
And we still see that. And so really these early goddesses, they had the power of creation. They were sacred. Oftentimes they had exaggerated hips and breasts to emphasize the ability that they had to create and sustain life. But they weren't just wombs. They also had a ton of wisdom and homemaking and art and connection and language. And it wasn't just one female goddess that ruled everything in the way that we think of the male god today. These goddesses were plural, meaning there was usually a pantheon, because that's how our community was. Everybody had gifts that they offered to the tribe, and that's what made you valuable. And so when we study, for example, indigenous communities today, which Abraham Maslow did with the Blackfoot population, He found that in America, in the West, it was only 1% of adults who were self-actualized, that they were living the life that they had planned and contributing to society and contributing to others, and had reached a point where they were living the life that they really, truly, authentically wanted to live. But in matriarchal indigenous communities, he noticed that it was about 80% of adults. I mean, it was the common norm that they were in this stage of human development. And so we lost something when we moved from matriarchy, which is plural and communal, and men were not just, in some kind of rat race and it just mattered what they could provide. They were also shaman. They also had their own gifts. They also had their own wisdom to offer the tribe. And the gods and goddesses that we had reflected that. Once agriculture happens, we start to stay in one place. And the thing that matters most is prime land, which means a lot more violence and resources, and also rain. And so we see someone like Yahweh, which was originally a Canaanite god and a pantheon of gods who had a female consort, Asherah. And eventually he becomes the sole and only God, the jealous God. I'm the only God. And eventually creation itself, which is insane to think about, that creation itself is just one male God without the female. Like how even does that happen? How does that reflect nature at all? And so this happened with our changes with agriculture. And like you said, it really spread across the world. We can see it very visibly with the Western religions and the Abrahamic religions, but even in the East, Confucianism still very much has patriarchy. Buddhism, some people are surprised in the West, is very patriarchal. We have early Buddhist texts that say that women are a roadblock to enlightenment. We have early Buddhist texts that say that that deceit is like excrement and women are full of deceit. That's a lovely early Buddhist scripture that we have too. So it spreads across the world because there's something about patriarchy in its dogmatism, in its colonialism, in its ability to control women and female reproduction, in its ability to create resources because it's so culty and it's no longer communal. And so it can push technology, it can push resources, it can push expansion at such a rate that the sad thing is that no matriarchy, no indigenous communities survived colonialism. Not a single one. Not a single one survived unscathed, even though matriarchy is more healthy for us mentally because it's more communal. It's not flipped patriarchy. It's not women in charge and women are the kings. That's what men are afraid of, that women are going to do to them what men did to women. But matriarchy was never like that. It was always communal. And so when we talk about how do we undo this, it's an invitation to men rather than an accusation to men. It's an invitation to say, hey, I got a lot of male clients. There's a male loneliness epidemic. There's male suicide, epidemic. And I'm not trying to hurt you by saying we can unpack some of this patriarchy stuff. It's how can we go back to ways of communal living that actually was more healthy for us. Now that's hard to do because patriarchy does win the wars, and so it writes the history.
Right.
And I don't know how we do that. I don't know how we handle that on a grand scale, but we can at least attack that on an individual scale. How does that change your relationship with you and your partner? How does that change how you want to create your own community at a local level? At least we can start there. Because we did lose something when God became a single man. Like something was lost there. We lost embodiment. We lost connection to nature. We lost connection to our bodies. We truly lost a lot when God became a single man versus plurality and versus having a feminine voice. And we see that even in spirituality today, even outside of religion. The example that I bring up the most often is that when men go to India for 3 weeks and sit on a mat and think about loving others because they're doing loving kindness meditations, we instantly say he's spiritual. We give him trophies. We call him a guru, all of that kind of thing, because he did some shadow work on a mat, or he thought about, loving everyone and everything and wishing everything well. And yet, for young mothers who are constantly doing shadow work, constantly doing ego work, because they want to be asleep, but instead they're up in the middle of the night choosing love and cleaning up poo off the floor. And we don't call that ego work. Like, we don't even call that spiritual. We just call that women's work. And so something really was lost when we lost the feminine. And so even though I'm hesitant at some of the woo world, because unchecked intuition has its own problems too. It's kind of the opposite. There's a shadow side to toxic masculinity, but there's also a shadow side to the feminine. Like, let's not pretend that that's not there. But I am at least happy to see that pendulum start to swing back to include the feminine, and especially to include embodiment, because so much of male spirituality has been transcending the body rather than actually getting deeper into your actual body and life, which is what we get from the female side of the conversation.
I
That was
think,
a big rant because it's
oh,
just one of my favorite rants.
I love that rant. It occurred to me while you were talking that one hypothesis for what happened is that as part of that quote unquote fall that I was talking about earlier, when you become separate, you consciously separate yourself from everything else in the universe as an individual. With that comes fear. Why did I put the fig leaf on? Why am I
Mm,
suddenly modest? Because suddenly I'm considering my otherness. And the number one thing that's going to come with that is fear. Fear of everything.
mm,
Why am I going to fear my neighbor coming and taking my stuff? You don't see nature walking around in anxiety and fear. It doesn't mean they're not responsive to threat, but like, they're not crippled with anxiety. They're not all requiring antidepressant meds, right? That's a unique human kind of condition. And to your point around when and why did the patriarchy sort of quote unquote spread and take over? If you have physical dominance and you're afraid
mm,
to both protect those you care about, who may be women, and also to dominate resources, whether it's land, whether it's food, whether it's sexual reproduction, whatever it is, then in your fear, you may be proactive in the execution of that dominance.
mm,
And if you play that out long enough, the people who survive, if you believe in epigenetics, and I sure as heck do, then the people who survive are the ones who were most proactive in their dominance. Why is it that women seem to have a bizarre sexual proclivity for aggressive men? That is an interesting sociological phenomenon that conceptually makes no sense to me, at least. But we see it represented, first of all, in
It
things like
it
50 Shades of
certainly,
Grey.
yeah, it certainly makes no sense in the modern world, because
Right.
I don't need a man to defend me from wolves. I need a man who can wire my wireless router. And those are like two different body types. But for some reason, like, the deeper, because our bodies are older than the world that we're living in, there's still kind of there can be an attraction. There's an attraction across the board, across society, that women will be attracted to men who are a couple years older,
Mhm.
have a little bit more resources, sometimes taller, or at least more masculine. But there's no reason for it in the modern world, and so you almost have to kind of see where we came from to make sense of that side of ourselves. That and Jordan Peterson talks about this with the Beauty and the Beast, that the deeper story of the Beauty and the Beast is that women kind of want someone who is strong enough to defend them, has that beast within them, but that can be tamed and can be sweet and can be generous. And that there's a reason that, in our ancient world, that women started to want that kind of man to survive in a patriarchy, that a beast who can be kind and gentle to you is kind of your best bet in that kind of world.
I do think that there's something to be said about masculine capacity, that to be meek and yielding is not necessarily the ideal for a male
Mm.
or anyone really. I think that the notion of being very physically capable and mentally and emotionally capable of anything, whatever is required, again, whatever the universe is calling forth, and maybe at some point in time that may be violence to protect a group of people around you because it's under immediate lethal threat. But the idea of having that capacity and then also having done the shadow work required to not have that a volatile capacity is I look at myself and I was in the military. I've done many years of mixed martial arts. And until I started going on this healing journey, the last, let's call it 4 years, I wouldn't have ever admitted to it. But in retrospect, I was a loaded gun and everyone I met had their finger on the trigger.
Mm.
And the question was just, are you going to push the buttons in the right order to make it go off?
Mm.
And that's a really hard concept to sort of keep in mind, is that, again, you don't want to completely eliminate masculinity. There's value in
No.
strength
And
and courage and confidence,
yes.
right?
And I think the caveat we need to throw into there, just because of the modern conversation around gender, that neither you or I are talking specifically about penises and vaginas.
Right.
Like, we're talking about, I just want to make that clear for the listener that we're talking about the traits that we've called masculine and put over here, and the traits that we've called feminine. And maybe there's a bell curve where there's some vague association between men and women, but that's going to be very individual. For example, my father has much more feminine traits. He's much more passive. He's much more nurturing, and my mother had a lot more both physical and kind of emotional strength, and showed a lot more of the masculine qualities. So we're not talking about gender specifically, but we're talking about there's a value in masculinity. There's a value in standing up for things, in the things that we've called masculine. There's a place for that. And there's a need for that, and there's also a need for the feminine. And when you talk about the flow state, for me, how that plays out is when you look at we have a hero's journey narrative, and we have the heroine's journey, and the heroine's journey kind of keeps going where the hero's journey ends. But the end of the heroine's journey is a reconciliation with the wounded masculine and the wounded feminine, so that you can flow in between both of those states, which means sometimes I can be intuitive and imaginative and creative and nurturing and passive and artistic, and the things that we've called feminine, language oriented. And sometimes I can be hyper rational because I'm in a debate and we are in rationality mode, and I can be strong, and I can set goals, and I can be action oriented, and I can do all the things that we've called masculine. And really, a lot of our flow state is the balance in between, because you are all of those things.
Right.
Nobody's totally GI Joe or Barbie, nobody. And so our ability to flow in both of those different kind of energies, if I were to use that word, or archetype, or just the fact that you're a human and you have both of those sides of you, a lot of that flow state is being able to see, does this situation call for these more these traits that we've called the masculine, or these traits that have been called the feminine, and being able to, as you say, kind of respond to whatever is being needed in that moment. And that's been a lot of, for me, what flow state means, is being able to flow in between those two states.
I completely agree with everything you just said. And one of the things that I'm noticing, having been through decades of therapy and done coaching and been a coach and gone to conferences and read hundreds of books, probably thousands of books, the stuff we call shadow work, the stuff we're working on in therapy, the wounds that we have, I think ultimately become the scar tissue that separate that beautiful, wide-eyed, awestruck, creative child that we all once were, and how we show up in the world. Right? It's that scar tissue that accumulates that stops us from expressing that divine femininity or that divine masculinity. And so we end up either suppressing or overexpressing. So one of the ways that I've seen this show up in people that I know is, let's say you're a female and you have extra femininity, or you have an absence of masculinity rather. And so you don't stand up for yourself. You don't set boundaries. And so you get walked on over and over and over for years, maybe decades. And then all of a sudden, you fucking snap because you've reached the end. Now what happens? Now you get painted as the crazy woman who lost her shit and is irrational and hyper and blah, 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 blah. When what's really happened is there's been a massive suppression of appropriate level of masculine, to use the term before, energy, right? To meet the situation where it's like, I'm holding, so here's the masculine and feminine together. I'm holding my boundary. I'm not going to let you say that to me. That's inappropriate. I'm sorry you're having a bad day. I'm sorry. I don't know what's going on. I'm not even going to presume. Something's going on with you that's making you express yourself in that way. I'm very sorry for whatever that is, but I'm not going to let you talk to me like that. And also, I'm here for you if you want to talk about it, right? Where you're holding the lines, like I'm putting the line in the sand. I'm not going to let you do that. And also, I love and care for you as a human being, right? This expression of both things at once. And what seems to happen is, because again, whatever wounds happened, where whatever you had to do to get love as a child ends up being the thing that you overemphasize, and whatever you had to do to avoid pain and suffering is the stuff that gets shut off. And both of those things ultimately end up becoming the work later in life. And so my work now, as somebody who's trying to play the game to win, is what's in the way of me being like that awe-inspired child every single day, where everywhere I go, everything is just amazing. Because it is. It is. The fact that anything exists should blow your mind nonstop. How is it that we exist? How is it that I put a seed in the ground and it grows a plant? That's insane. But we've lost touch with the wonder of it all because of all of this accumulation of scar.
And I don't know how much of that we can actually avoid. So I don't know if it's feasible, for example, the way that my 5-year-old is now, where she kind of just is in that space of just like, I feel my feelings and I'm alive, and let's look at this and let me taste this, and this is so cool and whatever. I don't know if anybody has ever just like actually sustained that into adulthood. It seems to be that human development, the healthiest thing to do at a young age is to build an ego. And when you build an ego, you're going to necessarily build a shadow. That's there's that is there can only be, if there's going to be light, if there's going to be kind of this ego driven thing, then there's going to be also this shadow thing that you don't show to society. And the purpose of building the ego seems to be that when we form that ego and when we have that security and identity and belonging, and this is me, we actually tend to later in life be better able to let that ego go and essentially wear it like clothing, where I get up and I can put on the I'm a Brittany and I like this thing and I do this kind of thing and this is the acronyms that I can put behind my name or whatever. But at any time, I can just take that clothing off and just be totally naked human to human. And that tends to be, rather than killing the ego, that tends to be the healthiest way to approach ego, is how can I wear this loosely like clothing so that I can use it for what, because the ego is just trying to protect you. And there's, we don't need to shame that part of ourselves. We're never going to be whole if we're trying to kill our ego. But it seems to be normal development to develop the ego and then be able to let it go. And so something I also see with women is sometimes they get into spiritual spaces where, like you were saying before, they're trying to kill the ego. But if you were born with like some strict parents or a narcissistic mother or in patriarchy or in a high demand religion, you probably never actually finished developing an ego in the first place. And so just like the balance that we talked about with the masculine and feminine, there's also a balance with the ego. And sometimes men who are 50 years old who go do ayahuasca because they've been a CEO all their life. And so ego dissolving is really healthy for them. That same tool, if you're on the other side of that spectrum where you have been so passive, you've been such a people pleaser your whole life that you actually don't even know who you are, that's not the tool for you. You don't need ego dissolving. You don't even have one. You didn't even finish developing that. So actually, it can be mind blowing for women because nobody talks about this side of things, that sometimes we can be overdeveloped in our ego and have to do some pullback there, but sometimes we can also be underdeveloped in our ego, and that the healthiest thing for some women to do, or if you're a gay man and have trauma with that, or anyone who's really not had the ability to develop a healthy ego, the most spiritual thing you can do is like personality development, dating yourself. What do you like?
One of
What
my
kind,
favorite
like,
Ram Dass
go
quotes
ahead. Yeah.
is you have to become somebody before you can become nobody.
And I think that's true as far as human development. That's what we're finding too, that we actually can't skip the pain that we feel, that we accumulate, that we were talking about, that seems to be a part of normal human development. But if we don't find ways as adults to break through that and open up again, then we're essentially either shutting down the magic of being alive, or we're numbing because we're just in pain all the time and now we're just watching Netflix and drinking and whatever. um, and so we do have to like open up those wounds again to be able to get back to that childlike state that we were once in. But it can be more sustainable as an adult because you can put on an ego when you need to, and you can also let it go, and just be and just play like we used to as children.
Speaking of ego and speaking of play, how has it been to go from where you were to suddenly having hundreds of thousands of followers? Some videos have millions of interactions. How have you managed to stay grounded and present and not get too swept away in what that could mean?
Yeah, it's something that I'm aware of because I've seen so many people go down that road. And I guess I don't have to name names here because then it gets to who said what and what's true and all of that. But let's just say that we all know people in the spiritual space who seem to get a little bit addicted to the money and the power and the ego. And just like religion is the best place to hide from God, there's a quote that says that. I do think that spirituality is one of the sneakiest places an ego can hide, because it's wrapped around in the world of spirituality. It feels like I'm a good person and I'm doing the right thing and I'm whatever. And so it can be sneakier to root out, actually, I'm getting addicted to feeling like I help people rather than actually helping people, right? And so it's something that I'm aware of because I've seen so many spiritual guru types fall into that trap. And there's one meditation that I really like. There's a there's a guy named Thomas McConkie. He comes from the same religious background as me, but then left that religion and spent some time in Buddhism. But he has this podcast called Mindfulness Plus, and he moves you through this guided meditation through money and sex and power and fame, just to see what shows up for you. Like,
Mm.
where does your ego, like, ooh, I like that. And for me, and I'm just going to be vulnerable here because it helps me to be vulnerable when I'm talking about shadow rather than talking about in the abstract. For me, it was fame, but it was specifically when someone says, "Let's ask Britt. I bet she'll know the answer." Something like that.
Mm.
My ego really likes that. My ego really likes that kind of attention. And so it's something that I talk openly about. Hey, this is my shadow. This is how it shows up. This is the temptation that I have in this space. And here are the three spiritual directors that I see to check myself. And here are the things that I do to make sure, hey, am I doing this because it's really about actually helping people and meeting people, and that gives me a lot of meaning and purpose? Or am I doing it to look like that guy or whatever? And it's something that I just continually ask myself, and I have others to be able to check me when I make, for example, business decisions, and I'm trying to best navigate how I spread tools that I think are helpful without being a snake oil salesman, which is really hard to do in this space. How do I And then I have education. I've spent 20 years in this space. I actually have a formal education in this space. Some of that deserves to be paid for. Like, that has value in the world. But yet, how do I not start, charging $2,000 for a course just because I can? I don't want to do that either. How do I So all of those questions, how I deal with it is just really being aware of it, having other people to check me who know that about me and can check me, and I can have conversations with, and just really staying close to that shadow side and being really vulnerable about my shadow side publicly hopefully helps me to be able to have the checks and balances I need to be able to really always be asking myself, why am I doing this? Um,
Did you unpack the source of that?
Go ahead.
Have you
The
found?
source of why I like
Yeah,
to
like
be.
when you were young, did you have
Yeah,
any authority figures who made you feel stupid or like you didn't know the answer?
it was kind of the opposite. It was that I moved around a lot as a kid. I moved every year. There was some instability with that, but I found that I could be a teacher's pet,
Mm,
and I could be really good in school, and I could give really good presentations, and I could be the smart one. And then there was also some of that was also actually, so my mom has some bipolar tendencies, and so part of my own wounded feminine was an aversion to feelings, because that felt a little bit out of control and scary for me, for my inner child. And so I really dove into philosophy and rationality, not because it's better. I can say now, not because it's better, it's just one side of looking at the problem, but because it felt really safe for me. So the combination of having some identity as teacher's pet
hmm
and having rationality and philosophy feel really safe, so diving into that kind of created, I think, that monster. Yeah.
That's interesting because it resonates with me. Fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, I would get these, 1-page assignments with questions that required 3 lines of answer, and I would flip over to the back and fill out the entire back of it. And I got this nickname, the Brain, at the time, and it was,
Mm,
in retrospect, it was because I didn't feel like I was seen as a valuable entity in my household. My dad was extremely abusive. And so it felt like this is a way of earning affection from an adult figure, an authority
mm.
figure. And then I hit puberty and everything went off the rails.
Yeah, for me too.
So, talk to me about the process of writing this book. When did you decide, okay, it's time? I know that you've written books in the past, but they seem to have been more like hyper specific in terms of helping folks who are escaping Mormonism or things like that. Like,
Mm,
what
mm.
made you feel like, okay, it's time to put this particular wisdom into print?
Yeah, so for that one, um, I really did it. For both books, I did just because I enjoy the process of doing it. So I didn't have any grand plans for this book is going to change the world, or I want to sell this many copies. That feels icky, just to write a book for that purpose and spirituality anyway. Really, I discovered, as part of this female embodiment journey, of what actually feels connective to me. What is my contemplative
Mm.
practice? Because when you're a mother of young children, it's not going to be sitting on a mat for 2 hours. That's not going to be it, right? Um, and so part of that was realizing that I get into a flow state when I'm writing,
Mm.
and I get into a state where I'm actually watching myself write and watching myself make connections. So it's very uh our subconscious all the time is making connections, and we have these eureka moments. Sometimes it's dreaming, sometimes it just kind of pops into our head. For me, those moments pop out when I'm writing. And so I really write every day now, regardless of what I'm doing. Sometimes it's just writing the material out that I'm going to say on TikTok, because I write everything that I've ever said online. I write out first, just because I tend to be a better writer than I am kind of off the top of
Your
my
writing
head.
is incredible, by the way. If I didn't say it at the beginning of this podcast, the quality of the prose is extraordinary. It it was
Thank
very
you.
surprising, not because I didn't expect it to be a good book, but it's really excellent writing. Like, it's interesting, it's engaging, it's not superlative in terms of word choices, it's easy to read.
Yeah, and that was really a part of the feminine journey that we've been talking about. Was, I've been in school, I've written in, I think we can call it more masculine ways, where it's highly academic, where everything is footnoted to some other white philosopher who said it, better with, or said it first, or whatever like that. And so part of the journey with this book was, I don't have to write in that way. Like, ideas don't have to be that obscure, and you have to use a thesaurus, and you have to use 1,000 footnotes. I've written in that way. I can write in that way. I've been in school long enough to write in that way. But there's something reclaiming of feminine to say these ideas can be discussed as if we're just talking like we are now, or talking at a coffee shop. And why can't that be okay too? Like, why can't that be valuable too? Why do we have to do this like peacocking academic way of writing to be valuable? And so a lot of that was just like rejecting that I have to write that way. I don't want to write that way. I want to write the way that I want to experience, which is, we want
Right.
the coffee shop talk more than we want to listen to highly academic papers, right? It's just more engaging. And so I write every day just because that is part of how I connect. That's how I connect to myself. That's how I connect to ideas outside of myself, which is part of my own spiritual practice. Um, and then kind of writing the book was just this really gift to my previous self, that as I was coming out of nihilism and needed tools but still wanted to hold on to my skepticism, um, how can I how would I navigate that? And so this book was really a gift to my previous self, that like I went on that journey and I gathered some tools, and they really helped and changed my life. And this is the book of that journey, and hopefully it'd be helpful. Even if only one other person read it and found it helpful, it would have been 100% worth my time, because the journey was what I was after, because that's my spiritual practice. Writing is a part of my
It's
spiritual
been really
practice.
beautiful watching your
Yeah, go
courage
ahead.
grow on social, because when you first started posting,
Mm,
you could feel the tension and you could sense that you were reading what you had written, and you're so
mm,
much more, I'll call it, in flow, right? You can tell that you're not
mm,
worried about what people are thinking anymore. You're just out there delivering your truth. And as a recipient, it's a lot more impactful, and it's beautiful to have seen that blossoming in quote unquote real time.
mm. Yeah, it's some content creators, I see them post things that they had said a year or two ago, because it can pop up. And I don't really, I tend to not post things that I've done a year ago, because the great thing about having an ego death is you can throw yourself into things that you want to do that you're
Right.
bad at. And when I started, I was bad at, I literally just like read word for word things that I had written to try to find my voice, to try to find what I was trying to say, to see how it landed with people, to see how I could phrase things better when I got checked. And I did get better at it, and I'm still getting better at it. But that is one of the benefits of having some ego deaths and some dark nights of the soul, is that, hey, I'm going to die. Like, I don't care that I look stupid on TikTok. Like, I'm going to be dead and forgotten in 3 generations. But I want to find other people who are thinking about the things that I'm thinking about. So I'm going to throw myself in my face, and the awkward way that I talk, and my long form TikTok content, because I don't like talking in 10-second clips, because that feels too restrictive for me. I need at least a couple minutes. And I'm just going to throw it out in the way that's authentic to me. And it's something that I really encourage others to do, that if you're in nihilism, the great benefit of that is the bravery that you get to throw yourself into life, into the kind of life that you want to have. And I want the kind of life where I have these discussions with other people. And you found me on TikTok. And so me throwing myself onto TikTok and doing that actually created today something that's worth being alive for, having this lovely
That's so
conversation.
sweet.
And so for me, social media was a part of that, but whatever that is for you, that's the benefit of nihilism. You already died. Now let's start. What kind of life do you want to have now? Throw yourself into that. And that's when life changes.
I almost don't even want to say anything. That was so beautiful. One of the other ways into this freedom that I discovered actually before nihilism, nihilism became almost like the supercharger for it, was Stoicism. So Tim Ferriss years
Mm.
ago had started talking about, I think it was Seneca, and how he would, and this is thousands of years ago, he would go out in the streets of Athens or wherever in the wrong color tunic, right? Which was it was anathema at the time. And the idea was to expose himself to social annihilation or the potential of it and see that you survive it and just keep going. And the way that started showing up for me was I wore pajamas to the grocery store. Now, that might sound in 2024 like the stupidest thing you've ever heard, and who cares? Because COVID happened and nobody cared anymore, right? But pre that, the idea that, at least for me, in the way I grew up in New England, like the idea that I am in a corporate job where everything's in, suits and ties most of the time. The idea of doing that was so impossible for me to get over that one little exercise suddenly led to a lot of other exercises. And what's interesting is I think that ultimately became the door into me being able to sort of explore my feminine side, was the courage to try things
Mm.
that were scary, and scary in a way that were like destabilizing kind of scary. Like the kind of thing where I don't think it was until 3 years ago that I could take my shirt off at a pool without having a panic attack, because I grew up with such
Mm.
body shame challenges, right? And we don't necessarily even see all these
Mm.
subconscious programmings that run us all the time. But whether you find it through Stoicism, you find it through nihilism, the freedom of understanding, we got one trip around this sun and we are in control of the experience, right? We're not victims, which doesn't mean bad things don't happen to us, but we are in control of how we respond to what's happened to us so far. Always in the moment. Viktor Frankl's the best example of that. I mean, if you haven't read Man's Search for Meaning, buy it today. Let it be the first thing that you read, because it will absolutely transform the way that you see
Yeah.
life.
And that book is really great for people who listen to you and I and say, "Well, you're so privileged. You get to, because privilege sometimes comes up in nihilism or atheism conversations, and certainly there may be some privilege to certain aspects of that, but no one can look at Viktor Frankl and say my life is worse than being in the Holocaust, and he still found a way to lean into meaning and purpose and being and connection and love, and was still worth being alive even there. And he noticed that people who didn't have that would essentially just give up and die, like they would, like their body would just shut down. And so whenever like privilege comes up in the
Right.
conversation, like, okay, but like read Viktor Frankl then, because your life isn't that bad. And like you have more freedom, infinitely more freedom than he did in that concentration camp. You have
100,000%.
more freedom than you think you do.
So, for folks who are listening to this conversation and maybe haven't made it into a nihilistic black hole, but are curious about spirituality or the intersection between science and religion in this world of something capital T truth that we can only approximate, we can never really get to, what would you recommend people do in terms of branching out and starting to in a low risk way, kind of get curious and play around?
Yeah, so I think the best place to start, and this is for me true for skeptics and also people who have been burned by religion or have experience with religion, is the safest low risk way to just dip your toe into this world without feeling like you're going to become. We all know someone who's probably gone a little bit too far down the rabbit hole and they're manifesting whatever. But if you just want to dip your toe and see if there's something here, I'd really start with the science of spirituality and start with something that we have solid science. We can call it spicy psychology, we can call it the science of well-being, we can call it like the Yale course that was so popular with burned out Yale students that they opened it up for everyone. There's a free online course that you can do called the Science of Happiness because it was the most popular course at Yale because all of these, you know, headstrong, very headspace kids were just absolutely burning out in their
Wow.
programs, showing up at this happiness course, and it was changing their life. And it was so impactful to the entire campus that they essentially offered it to everyone for free. And so I would start there. Like, let's start with the science. Like, let's just start in a safe place before we jump into maybe some of these places that feel very woo or feel very scary. So, something like rituals. We have science that shows that you can make up a ritual, and we have data that says that you scientifically
Mm.
process emotions out of your body faster when you have a ritual. So if I were to offer you 300, like we have two groups of people, we say we're going to offer someone $300, someone actually gets $300, everybody else is disappointed. If you, even if it's made up, okay, write about your feelings, sprinkle salt on it, crumple up the paper, throw it over your left shoulder. When they created a ritual to process that experience, if you asked them an hour or two later, how do you feel about that? They're totally over it. They've moved on. The people who didn't do a ritual, they were still bummed that they didn't get the $300. They were still thinking about the things they could have done with the $300. Um, Rituals help mark our values. They can increase pleasure. They can decrease pain to the point that we're starting to add it to some high level hospitals, starting to add some things because it's showing that it decreases pain. So let's start with the science of awe, the science of rituals, the science of community, the science of different states of consciousness that we can see in an fMRI machine, that we're looking at the brains of these long-term meditators, and the part of your brain that's super neurotic and self-obsessed and negative is just really small and quiet, and everything else is really active, connection and things like that. And their brains look younger and look healthier and they're happier, and we can actually see data on that. It's not just woo. Like, we're looking at these brains and they are different than the typical neurotic brains that we all have. And so I think for me, just stepping into the science of it helped me to have the confidence to take a step into this world. You can also always just find a guide, and I recommend doing it with a guide. But if you have a friend of a friend who's a guide and who will sit with you, psychedelics can also be a way to just at least show you, hey, this other way of being exists. And then you can find ways to open that door with your waking mind so that you don't have to be on drugs all the time to get there, which I think is one of the dangers of that world. But for some really skeptical people, just giving them like a Sam Harris, like just giving them mushrooms, open them up to a different way of being that they didn't understand or know was possible. So I really think that we can start with the science and stay really grounded in the science, before we have to start jumping to theories that start to get a little bit woo or a little bit kind of down the rabbit hole. And that would be the best place to start.
So helpful. Britt, this has been a beautiful conversation.
I really enjoyed our conversation. These are the kinds of conversations that just make me so happy to be alive.
Well, it's an honor to have you say that. I hope that the folks who listen to this got a lot out of it. I'm sure they will. If you'd ever be willing to do a part two in the future, I'd love to double click on the mushroom concept because
Mm,
that was very useful for me. And I think there's a lot of people who are curious but still scared. And I think
mm,
being apprehensive and careful is a good idea. scared maybe is a little bit too much on the outside. But I love getting into those components, but that might keep us for another 2 hours if we get too deep into that.
Probably. Yeah, probably.
So thank you so much for everybody who's still here. No Nonsense Spirituality, absolutely a must read.
Thank you. Thanks so much.